Thank you for joining us today on the Old Black Book television program. I am Christopher Horn, pastor of the West Milton Baptist Church. We bring you this program with the goal of lifting up Christ, proclaiming the gospel, and encouraging the saved. We invite you to attend our services or visit us on the web at www.wmbchurch.com. We hope that you enjoy today's edition of the Old Black
Read this morning first, but having turned to chapter 4, I want you to understand this morning that chapter 4 is not our text. The text passage that will be ours this morning relates to us a divine confluence of events in the lives of three people. These three people would be a homeless woman, an out-of-touch king, and a disgraced servant. All three of these, having their own lives, having their own set of circumstances and things going on in their lives, find themselves coming together in a manner in which none of them could have ever seen, nor could they have ever brought to pass for themselves. This passage will teach us about the events of life that seem to us, at least when they happen, to be of little to no importance. They seem to us to be just random events or small occurrences, small things that are happening and taking place in our lives. But in reality, they are more likely to be the necessary links in the chain which divine providence is forging to bring about the events of our life, or to bring us to the place where God would have us to be, to do good for us, and of course to glorify Himself. So it is with that thought in mind, I want you to be introduced to these three individuals. Again, a homeless woman, an out-of-touch king, and a disgraced servant. First of all, here in 2 Kings chapter 4, the woman is introduced to us here in verse number 8. 2 Kings chapter 4 and verse number 8. And it fell on a day that Elisha passed to Shunem, where was a great woman, and she constrained him to eat bread. And so it was that as oft as he passed by, he turned in thither to eat bread. And she said unto her husband, Behold now, I perceive that this is an holy man of God, which passeth by us continually. Let us make a little chamber, I pray thee, on the wall, and let us set for him there a bed, and a table, and a stool, and a candlestick. And it shall be, when he cometh to us, that he shall turn in thither. As the woman is introduced to us here, we see her beginning a relationship with a man of God known to us as Elisha. She begins to care for his needs. She sets food before him at the first. Continuing further in this calling of hospitality and care, she, with her husband, creates a room, a prophet's quarters, as it becomes called after this, for him to rest in, for him to be housed in as he passes by this way on his duties in service of the Lord. And so it is that he comes in, he lays down, he takes his rest there from time to time, and a relationship is built between him and this woman. We see down in verses 16 and 17 of chapter 4 that as things progressed, Elisha had asked, What shall be done for thee to reward thee for what you have done for me? And of course, she wants nothing in return. But her servant points out the very fact that she has no child and her husband's old. And so it is that in verse number 16, Elisha has the blessed privilege of delivering to her the prophecy that she would soon have a son. Verse 16, And he said, About this season, according to the time of life, thou shalt embrace a son. And she said, Nay, my lord, thou man of God, do not lie unto thine handmaid. And the woman conceived and bare a son at that season, that Elisha had said unto her, according to the time of life. So she brings a child into this world, a blessed child, of course, as it was her only. Her husband being old, a miracle takes place here, and she's able to have a son. As you read down further in chapter 4, we find that in the process of time, this child is injured. He goes to work with his dad. gets out of arm's reach, falls upon a rock, injures his head, and dies. Of course, this being her only son, the son of her old age and promise, she's very distraught by this and seeks for Elisha, the man of God, just knowing within her heart by faith that he could do something about this, that he could raise her from the dead. Look down to verse number 31. As she comes and speaks to Elisha, Elisha sends Gehazi ahead of him to see the boy. Verse 31, and Gehazi passed on before them and laid the staff upon the face of the child, but there was no voice, nor hearing. Wherefore he went again to meet him and told him, saying, the child is not awaked. And when Elisha was come into the house, behold, the child was dead and laid upon his bed. He went in therefore and shut the door upon them twain and prayed unto the Lord. And he went up and lay upon the child and put his mouth upon his mouth and his eyes upon his eyes and his hands upon his hands. And he stretched himself upon the child, and the flesh of the child waxed warm. Then he returned and walked in the house to and fro, and went up and stretched himself upon him. And the child sneezed 7 times. And the child opened his eyes. And he called Gehazi and said, call this Shunammite. So he called her. And when she was come in unto him, he said, take up thy son. Then she went in and fell at his feet, bowed herself to the ground, and took up her son and went out. She receives a great blessing here by one of the greatest miracles that Elisha does during his ministry. He raises this child from the dead. This Shunammite woman who began to care for Elisha, built a relationship with Elisha, receives the news of being pregnant through Elisha, now receives the greatest blessing of all in seeing this glorious miracle transpire and take place. Now, until we get to our text passage, we hear really nothing more from this Shunammite woman. But one thing that I strongly believe is that she kept in touch with Elisha. This was a relationship that continued. She knew he was the man of God that spoke the voice of God, the words of God, wanted to be with him and help him and all of those kinds of things. And so that relationship continued. So she's the first that we meet in this divine confluence of events. The second we've already been introduced to by reading here in chapter 4, but the second is the disgraced servant, Elisha's right-hand man, Gehazi. We noticed and studied a month or so ago in chapter 5 of 2 Kings that Elisha performs a miracle on Naaman, removes his leprosy, restores unto him his health and his life, and does so much for him. But here in chapter 5 in verse number 16, we find ourselves seeing here a situation develop where Naaman wanted to repay Elisha for his healing, wanted to reimburse him, wanted to give him a gift. And here in verse 16, Elisha says, no, I'll receive nothing of thy hand. Verse 16, but he said, as the Lord liveth, before whom I stand, I will receive none. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. So Elisha, wanting to observe the proprieties of life, desired not a gift from this man. He didn't want it to appear as if he was getting paid to do this miracle and heal. He didn't want to be a prophet for hire. Okay, there's nothing wrong with being supported, but he felt like this was wrong and didn't take it. But as we drop down to verse number 20, we find Gehazi. And we see he had a different opinion. He was angry. He was angry that Elisha had healed Naaman. He was even further angered that he had a chance to be enriched by it and didn't. And so Gehazi decides, I'm going to relieve Naaman of some of his riches. We notice here in verse number 20. But Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, the man of God, said, behold, my master hath spared Naaman the Syrian, in not receiving at his hands that which he brought. But as the Lord liveth, I will run after him and take somewhat of him. So Gehazi followed after Naaman, and when Naaman saw him running after him, he lighted down from the chariot to meet him, and said, is all well? And he said, all is well, my master hath sent me, saying, behold, even now there be come to me from Mount Ephraim 2 young men of the sons of the prophets. Give them, I pray thee, a talent of silver and 2 changes of raiments. He lied. He says, my master hath sent me, and he wants some of those riches you promised him. He even concocted a story. He concocted a story to go along with it. We see that he does give him not just 1 but 2 talents of silver for each of the 2 fictional sons of the prophet, 2 changes of garments to go along with it, and Gehazi goes back, hides the things in his house. And notice here in verse number 25, he's called before Elisha. It says, and he went in and stood before his master. And Elisha said unto him, whence comest thou, Gehazi? And he said, thy servant went no whither. And he said unto him, went not mine heart with thee, when the man turned again from the chariot to meet thee? Is it a time to receive money, and to receive garments, and oliveyards, and vineyards, and sheep, and oxen, and manservants, and maidservants? The leprosy, therefore, of Naaman shall cleave unto thee, and unto thy seed forever. And he went out from his presence, a leper as white as snow. The servant which had for so long been by Elisha's side had seen all the miracles that he had done, here through a bad series of choices becomes disgraced. He lies to Naaman, not once but twice. He lies to his master Elisha. He here is disgraced because of all of that, and he's given that very disease that Naaman was healed from. What a dreadful turn of events here in the life of Gehazi. And now as we consider all of these things, and I know we're quickly moving through these characters, but all of these events, all of these things that are taking place in their life, all the things that take place in our lives, we need to see as just more than random occurrences and random events. We say and believe that God is in control, but how strongly do we really believe that? To what degree do we believe that He is in control? To what degree do we believe that He is the one that is ordering the course of events and working through providence to bring about that which He would in our lives? Oh yes, when we study the book of Revelation, we can all agree, we see His hand at work because of these big events unfolding. We see His hand at work in the world stage and prophecy to come. And those things are great. We love to study them, believe them, and that's wonderful. What we're talking about this morning is in the small, day-to-day, routine things of life. If God is in control of one, He has to be in control of the other. If God works by divine providence to bring about the one, then He also has to be at work in divine providence to bring about the other, or God is not God. And so we see these various things taking place in these people's lives. The third character in this story, when we get to our text, will be the out-of-touch king. The out-of-touch king. For this, we go back to 2 Kings 3. The out-of-touch king that is reigning during the time of Elisha is Ahaz's son, Jehoram. We see he comes to power here in verse number 1. Now Jehoram, the son of Ahab, began to reign over Israel in Samaria, the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and reigned 12 years. And he wrought evil in the sight of the Lord, but not like his father and his mother, for he put away the image of Baal that his father had made. Nevertheless he cleaved unto the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which had made Israel to sin. He departed not therefrom. So as far as standards go, Jehoram was a little better than his predecessor, which isn't saying a whole lot, because Ahab was about as bad as it got, especially when considering his wife Jezebel. They were the two that Elijah had stood against on Mount Carmel, that Elijah had stood before and stood up to and fought with, and all of those things. And now we see his son coming to power, his son coming to reign. What is said of him is that he didn't worship Baal. He put away the images of Baal. That's good. But what he did do was maintain the worship of calves, which Jehoshaphat, but his predecessor one of his predecessors was Jeroboam, was guilty of introducing. So he was a little better than Ahab, but certainly he was not a godly man. He was not a man that sought after God's own heart. None of the kings of Israel were once the kingdoms divided. And so this king, though he was in touch with the economics, the finance, he was in touch with trade, he was in touch with security, he was in touch with everything about his reign, but he was out of touch with Elijah. He was out of touch with God. He knew some of what Elijah had done. Do we remember when Elijah was telling the king of Israel the troop movements of the Syrians? Okay, so he had to know some of what Elisha was doing within the kingdom of Israel. But he was not a man that sought Elijah. The only time recorded we have that he went to Elisha was when, here in chapter 3, him and Jehoshaphat and the king of Syria at that time got together and they decided to go and fight. Problem was they had no water and they were instructed to dig ditches by Elisha. And if you read that story out, you'll find that Elisha did not want to go and stand before the king at that time, not because he was afraid, but because he knew what kind of man that he was. He was out of touch with God, out of touch, again, with all of these things, but he was the one in power at this time. He was the one in control. So it is now, having met these three characters, the homeless woman, the formerly disgraced servant, and the out-of-touch king, that we go to our text in 2 Kings chapter 8. As we turn here and begin to look at what takes place here in chapter 8, it will involve all three of these characters. And we find in this text the chains of providence being forged by God. And what we mean by that statement is, when you look at a chain, it's made up of links. You know that someone, some kind of metal worker or smith has forged that chain. In other words, they have intentionally linked those chain links together to make a length, that it might be used for some purpose. And so it is with our lives. The events, the things that take place, all of the seemingly small and insignificant things that transpire in our lives, let us think of them as a chain made up of links that God, through His divine providence, has forged to bring us to a certain place. In other words, to make the chain a certain way to be used for a certain task. Now, a week from now, if the Lord hasn't returned and I'm still alive, that chain is going to be added to. Those links are going to be added to. And so it is that perhaps I might be used in a different way. I mean, again, chains have all types of uses, small, strength-wise, long, all of these things. They have different uses. And so these links in the chain add to who we are in our experiences in our life, and they cause us to be ready for what God would do for us in our lives. So again, I ask, do we believe that God is in control? Do we believe that divine providence is at work? Coincidence is often the word we use to explain away the sovereign working of God in the events of our lives, except for perhaps the really large things, except for perhaps the really outlandish things in which we understand are the hand of God at work. But far too often we see things as coincidental. We see things as happenstance. We see things as luck. And we don't relate to the fact that God, through His sovereignty and His hand of providence, is at work. This is especially true for the small and insignificant. And what we need to keep in mind is that there is no such thing as coincidence. Now, get this thought. There is no such thing as coincidence, only events and circumstances that we have yet to understand how they fit together to form our chain, how they fit together to make us who we are in the service of the Lord, that we may not understand the relation and purpose of as yet. That doesn't mean that they are without purpose. It means that we don't understand it yet. It may seem as random or as coincidence, but that doesn't mean that that's the reality. It may be our perception, but not our reality. And so it is that we need to realize that even though we don't understand it, it's not coincidence. It's the hand of God and His providence at work in events that we are yet to understand the relation of. That's a good way to look at what we're thinking of this morning. Now, to our text. We're going to be met with these three characters once again. Verse 1, chapter 8, 2 Kings. Then spake Elisha unto the woman, whose son he had restored to life, saying, Arise and go thou and thine household and sojourn wheresoever thou canst sojourn, for the Lord hath called for a famine, and it shall also come upon the land 7 years. And the woman arose and did after the saying of the man of God, and she went with her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistine 7 years. This particular verse, especially verse 1 and 2 here, is why I made the statement before that even though we don't see the Shunammite interacting with Elisha from chapter 4 to chapter 8, they maintain some kind of communication. They maintain some kind of relationship. Because as Elisha got the word from God that there was 7 years of famine coming, the first thing it seems like that he thought to do was to warn this woman. And there are so many side thoughts that we could get into here. Gives us a picture of God removing His people again from judgment. We think about the ark. We think about Lot. But what about this woman? She was taken away from this place and provided for, just as we will be, of course, before the tribulation comes and all of that happens. And so it is that Elisha says, Go where thou canst. Get away from this land for now, because there is a famine coming. And she sojourns for 7 years, the land of the Philistines. Even the word sojourned speaks to us, because it means that she maintained her separation from the Philistines as she could. She was a visitor in their land for 7 years. She didn't put down roots. She didn't become a Philistine citizen. She didn't give over to their way of life. But she maintained as best she could. Even though she didn't have a place to sacrifice, even though she didn't have the ability to observe the new moons and the Sabbaths and all of that, she maintained the best she could during this time. The man of God told her to leave. And we see that she was obedient, and she goes unto the land of the Philistines for this period of time. Now in verse 3, we see what happens when she comes back. And this is why we call her a homeless woman. Verse 3, And it came to pass at the 7 years' end that the woman returned out of the land of the Philistines. She went forth to cry unto the king for her house and for her land. So she comes back after the 7 years, again showing her heart was in Israel and not in the land of the Philistines. She returns, and she brings her son with her. It is conjectured that her husband has died by this point, because he's nowhere in this. That's not supported necessarily, but an insight that perhaps could be true. She comes back and finds that her land has been overtaken. During her absence, either squatters had moved in, or the crown had seized it and used it to produce food as best they could. Whatever the case was, she comes back to find that her ancestral land had been taken away. And this is a big deal. This was why in the book of Ruth, she needed Boaz to restore unto her the land and all the possession and everything that she had had before. Otherwise, she had nothing. This woman as well is in that same place. She needs. If her husband had been present, I think it would have been a whole lot easier. But he didn't have that. So her only play here is to go to the king. And in verse 3, that's exactly what she says, or it tells us that she is going to do. She's going to go to the king, and she's going to cry unto the king and ask the king to have the land restored. So basically throw herself at the mercy of an ungodly, king, and see what happens. I mean, that's the best that she could do. And we see that's what she had planned on, and that's what she does. Now notice here in verse number 4, we find Gehazi and the king coming into this story, into this confluence of events. I mean, I want you to think of this, as rivers running together. All right? When you find the beginning of the Ohio River, it's the confluence, isn't it? It is the coming together of other rivers to form that river. And so what we have here is a confluence of events, many events, in three separate people's lives over the course of many years coming together to one point. One point. And all of them seem to be, somewhat insignificant. I don't want to belittle the things that they all went through and everything, but they all come together at this one point. In verse number 4, as the woman's coming to talk to the king, this is what's going on in the king's life. And the king talked with Gehazi, the servant of the man of God, saying, Tell me, I pray thee, all the great things that Elisha hath done. So at this time, in the court of the king, where this woman is headed, there's a conversation going on. Now, to try to understand why this conversation is happening is very difficult. What brought it on? We don't have any clue. Was Jehoram feeling some kind of conviction at this time and called for the servant of Elisha to come? It seems as if he'd been restored at this time and was still, in relation with Elisha. Was it something along those lines? Could have been. For whatever reason, we don't know what it is, he calls for Gehazi to come, and the purpose of his coming was he wanted Gehazi to recount to him all the things that Elisha had done. All the miracles, all of the work, all of the blessings, all the things. His motive, even for that, could have been evil intent. An indictment against him. I don't know. But the point is that he brought him together at this moment to recount all the things that Elisha had done, and that was a long list. We have looked at much of it over the course of the last couple of months, as the Lord has led us to, and we've seen many events. And so Gehazi starts to tell him, well, this is what happened when Elijah was taken up, and Elisha got a double portion of the Spirit, and so on and so forth, down through the ministry of Elisha. There are many things for him to tell, and many stories for him to relate unto the king. But by divine providence, it was at this moment, when we get into verse number 5, you're going to see the words, and it came to pass. Who do you think brought it to pass? And it came to pass. It didn't just happen. Who do you think made it? God made it happen. In this way, at this time, that Gehazi was there, having been called, that Gehazi was speaking to the king about all of Elisha's things that he had done. But it gets even better than that, because we find in verse number 5 the specific event that Elisha, or that Gehazi was relating unto the king that Elisha had done. Here in verse 5, and it came to pass, as he was telling the king how he had raised a dead body to life, that behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life cried to the king for her house and for her land. And Gehazi said, My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life. What a confluence of divine events, links in the chain of providence that brought everybody together at this moment, not just in one place at one time, but even in the story that Gehazi was relating to the king. As this woman walks in, and you couldn't just walk into the king's court. You had to go through all of the security and all of the rigmarole. It was certainly something that could only have been orchestrated by God. But as you look at the individual events, in some ways they seem quite small. This woman's like, well, my last recourse, and I don't expect it to be that great, is to go talk to the king. So I'm going to go talk to the king. Gehazi says, man, I was summoned down to talk to the king. I'm going to go relate to him these things. The king's just thinking, I want to hear, I want to indict, I want to be blessed, whatever it is. All small things. And yet God worked to bring them all together at the same time, so that the woman walked in to plead for mercy of the king at the exact moment that Gehazi was telling the king about her son being raised from the dead. All of a sudden Gehazi was able to say, right there he is. He was dead before, and now he's alive. This is the woman I've been telling you about. And now the woman comes forth and says, I don't have a place to live. It's been taken away. Imagine, though it is mind-boggling, how many divine links in the chain that this event, had to have forged together to come about. And how long these events were unfolding just for this one moment in time to unfold just the way that it did. And we'll see in just a moment how it worked in everybody's life. But just understand that it wasn't something that, was random, of course, or coincidental. I think you get that. But it also wasn't something that, just happened because God wanted him here and there and everywhere. No, this was God's intent for this moment in history, for these three people to be in this place at this time, to be thinking and talking about this event for his honor and for his glory. And let us understand how big God is, because for every moment of every day of our lives, for every individual upon the face of the earth, God has the same thought in mind. There is that divine confluence of events that meets together every time that clock ticks over a new minute, if you want to use that division of time. Every new minute becomes the divine confluence of events. For that moment, God has orchestrated, that he has brought things together. And you know what? You couldn't see it coming. You couldn't see it coming. This woman, no doubt, went there thinking, I doubt I'm going to be successful. I've been gone this long. This man isn't known to be a godly man, and I'm a godly woman. I just don't expect to be successful. Gehazi going there to represent Elisha and talk about his works, wondering what the outcome's going to be. And the king, of course, oblivious to any of this. And yet you see God bringing it all together and working in their lives. Now, if God can work in the small, he can work in the big, and in everything in between. We see it happening here so plainly before our eyes. This reminds us, of course, that nothing happens by accident. This reminds us that God is working in every single event of our lives. God orders the events of our lives to glorify himself and also to work for our good. So what does it mean? What did it mean for these three? I want to caution you against thinking that we are always going to be able to understand the providential works of God and how they work in our life and bless us. We're not. It doesn't always work that way. But here we're able to see a couple of things that it worked out here and how it blessed these. I mean, the words of Gehazi, the thoughts of the king, the desires of the woman, they're all drawn together in this one moment, all for the purpose of working in their lives. It seems as if, to me, the main purpose of this, if we might say it that way, is found in verse 6. And when the king asked the woman, she told him, so he wanted verification, she provided it. So the king appointed unto her a certain officer, saying, Restore all that was hers, and all the fruits of the field, since the day that she left the land, even until now. The main purpose, it seems, from this confluence of events, is this is how God chose to restore this woman's land. She left in faith, being instructed by God to do so. She comes back without, and God provides. But let us also understand that in the confluence of events, that there is never only one thing God is trying to do or is doing. There is never only one purpose. Because this doesn't just work in her life. Though it does restore her land, you also see that she was restored the fruits of the last 7 years. That's why we said perhaps the king or the crown had seized it and used it to provide whatever food they could. And so she's reimbursed for that. She is given the funds or the fruit, if it was still stored up, of what it produced these last 7 years. So God had given her more than she could have ever asked for in this situation. And you know what? As she walks away from this, She can't even see all of the links in the chain. She can't even begin to see what it took for the king to have forethought and call for Gehazi to come and have the stories to tell. And even further than that, for the original events that took place, to have the stories to tell to start with. I mean, it just gets bigger and bigger. As this woman left and she goes back home and she receives everything unto herself, she could have not seen all of those things. But yet they were still as real. And you and I can't always see all the links and the chains around us or the things that God is doing, but rest assured He's doing them. Rest assured He is working. This also, I believe, works on behalf of Gehazi. Gehazi had formerly been disgraced. He had been stricken with leprosy. Now, being the king could have been in the presence of a leper and spoken to him, at some length, distance, if you will. It wouldn't have been against the law of Moses. He's not a priest. He's not someone that works in the temple. He could have done this. And, so Gehazi gets the opportunity once again to be used by God. He gets a second opportunity. He gets a second chance. Let's put it that way. A second opportunity to be used by God on behalf of Elijah to redeem himself after being restored. And so he's able to be blessed in that manner. And it shows Gehazi who's in charge. Because Gehazi before had said, my master left all this money on the table. We need it. I'm going to go get it at all costs. Now God, through these series of events, shows Gehazi, I don't need your help. I'll work whatever I want to work, and I'll bring about whatever I want to bring about. You don't need to do it on your own. You don't need to make it happen. It's sin when you do. And then, of course, the king. The king was able to see face to face a miracle in that child. That child showed forth the divine power of God in bringing him back to life. And how could the king say no to one that God had worked so miraculously in? He was able to see the power of God reflected in this and be awestruck even by the confluence of events that took place. Almost unbelievable, but he had witnessed them, so he had to believe them. And it really would have made him very accountable unto God and shown him the power of God. Now we have nothing to draw from to believe that it changed his life in a great way, but still there would have been an impact. I mean, it caused him to be gracious to this woman, caused him to give her more than she deserved, and to appoint even unto her a special servant or someone to go with her and all these things. What a blessing. And the point is that God worked in these lives over the course of years. I mean, Joram, as he's referred to, or Jehoram, he's referred to as both, he reigned for 12 years. And by this time, we're almost at the end of that 12 years. We're getting close. And we find him having been worked upon by God even throughout all of this time. Not unto repentance, not unto faith, not unto those things, but God was ordering the events to bring about this moment. The life of the woman, her relationship with Elisha, everything that happened as her son was raised from the dead, and further on down the line as she went, as she was instructed to find shelter somewhere else. And even in Gehazi, here, all of these things God is working, bringing together in one moment. And so the question becomes, what do we do with this? And we'll address that a little bit tonight. But what we need to do with providence is to trust it. But we also need to consider it. And that'll be where we dwell tonight upon, because these seemingly random things speak to us, and they're elegant. I mean, they are beautiful as God orchestrates them to come together in our lives. We should never take for granted where we are and what's going on, because God has worked and brought us to that place. Now, that doesn't so much apply if you're, way off in sin and all those things. Don't say that's where God wants you to be, because that's not where He wants you to be. But if we are right with God and serving God and have no great sin in our life and are right with Him, we can understand that, believe it, and believing it will help us in our lives make sense of the seemingly random things that transpire and take place, and give us great confidence as well, knowing that at this moment God is at work. But you know what? He didn't start working today. He started working our lives a long time ago. And even there was Brother Don Titus preached a sermon years ago, and he was able so elegantly to bring about even the facts of his mother and father being born and brought into this world, and their upbringing, and them going to church, and how all of that God used to bring him to the place where he was. And that is all so true. So let us stand.
Thanks for joining us for today's edition of the Old Black Book. We pray that it has been a blessing to you today. We hope to see you sometime in our services, or that you will at least contact us. We pray that if but only for a moment today you will consider your need for Christ. He truly is the way, the truth, and the life. Join us again next week for another edition of the Old Black Book television program.